Our public schools are a place where all kids feel like they belong.
My children.
My family. My community.
All students.
All students.
All students belong in a great public school.
Let's get ready for back to school at nea.org/backtoschool.
This is Jason Blair, and this is a Silver Linings Handbook bonus episode. For the past 2 weeks, we've explored the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous people with an expert on disappearances, Ed Densel. Ed's the host of the Unfound podcast. As a bonus, I wanted to share with you a recent appearance I had on Santana True Crime, discussing the case of Ashley Loring Heavyrunner. Ashley is a 20-year-old woman who went missing on the Blackfeet Reservation in Montana in early 2017. Ashley wanted to be an advocate for missing and murdered Indigenous women before she became one herself. Ashley's case remains unsolved, but it's one of the cases about Indigenous people that's broken through. And her sister, Kimberly, has not only used that to help her sister's case, but also to become an advocate for others. Kimberly came on the show earlier this year where she made the clarion call to bring her sister home, even saying that she would forego justice just to bring her sister back. The host of Santana True Crime is Cameron Santana. He's also the co-author of the book Murder on Campus, The Professor, the Cop, and North Carolina's Most Notorious Cold Case. He came on to discuss the book with his brother, Brian, a few months ago. The book is about the 1973 murder at the University of North Carolina, Asheville, of 19-year-old Virginia Marie Olson. That's a great episode, and I hope you enjoy this episode and check out many more of the episodes on Santana True Crime.
Time doesn't erase murder. It just hides it better. They said the case was closed. They said no one was watching. But someone always is. Enter the shadows, where every whisper is a clue, and the line between justice and obsession disappears. This is Santana True Crime.
Welcome to Santana True Crime. Tonight, we've got a special guest. I've got Jason Blair on the show. Jason is an author, podcaster, consultant, and he's a heavily invested person in a case that we're going to be talking about tonight, Ashley Loring Heavyrunner. Jason, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Cameron. It's so great to be on your show, especially after having you on mine, where it was really awesome to talk about the Ginger Olson case and the work that you and Cameron did on it. I'm really, as you guys can tell from our interview, impressed with the work you did on it, the way you collaborated on it, the things that you guys found. But I just really love the fact that, and I know this comes off in the episode, that your hearts are so deeply into the things that you're doing. And, I hear phrases like this often, that when a victim dies, the first death is when they actually die, and the permanent death is when they're forgotten. And I really appreciate the fact that you're keeping her story alive.
Well, that's something that we're both really proud of, is the fact that we took a case that a lot of people had never heard of, and now it's been spread across the entire country, as well as England, Australia. And so, yeah, it really becomes a part of you.
Yep.
And it's one of those things that you never stop working on it or thinking about it. And it really becomes a lifetime investment.
Yep. And I think you probably, as somebody who's a police officer, and I think for me as a journalist, as much as we have to separate our emotions from the decisions that we make and the things that we look into and the things that we have to do in our jobs, our emotions are still there, and we do really get invested. And I think the best people in either role, the role of a journalist or the role of a police officer, are the ones who do care, and they care. They can separate themselves from that care to try and find the truth or to make the best decision. But I think the ones who do care are going to be the ones who have the most positive impact on people and most positive impact on society.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's one of the challenges in cases like this with Ashley is getting people to care and getting people to know her name with a population that has traditionally just been pushed aside.
Yep. And I think that there are a lot of reasons that happens. And I think, one of the core reasons, there are a lot of sort of systemic issues that run around it. I think a lot of it too has to do with the fact that we as people, just human beings, we gravitate to and we pay attention to that which we're familiar with. And, if you grow up in an inner city, you're going to experience and you're going to connect with some people who are Black. If you, go off to college, you're going to run into people of all sorts of different races. Well, Indigenous people are such a small percentage of our population, and they're in very remote areas, much more rural, much more remote, isolated areas. And I think this is a trend that probably goes back to first contact. I think on top of the fact that there's that disconnection, there's been this deliberate erasure. As somebody who is a Black American, ancestor of slaves on both sides of my family, that history, the Black American experience, it's really going to be hard to erase it from the broader American story. It's a part of it for all of us. But I do think there's been this deliberate erasure since the beginning of Native stories. And I think part of the reason why I focused on it, I think last week, I think we've had our 12th episode or 13th episode on a Native case. Part of the reason why I focus on it is because I am just dedicated to allowing them to be erased from our history. And, one of the great benefits of that has been watching on my podcast over time, watching this group of listeners emerge who will send me messages saying that they never realized that this problem of missing and murdered Indigenous people or missing and murdered Indigenous women existed, and they want to know what they can do to help. And you mentioned Ashley. I went out to Montana earlier this year, and one of my listeners came out. Another one of my listeners is trained with canine cadaver dogs, has connected with the family to look at some sites. So listeners do have an opportunity to engage and get involved and make a difference. And I love that part of that. So,
well, let's get into this case because I really appreciate you wanting to do this case. First of all, I know that I told you in the pre-interview that it was a case that I had seen before, just a show, I think it was like 2020 or Dateline, but never really dug into it, and especially all the issues around the investigative side. I mean, it is a complex maze of bureaucracy as well as the social and economic problems that you were bringing up. But for people that are not aware of this case, can you go through the basic facts of what we know about Ashley and about the disappearance?
Yeah. So Ashley Loring Heavyrunner grew up. She was, grew up in the 90s on the Blackfeet Reservation in Montana. two sisters, one older and then a younger sister, Kimberly Loring, who's a big advocate for her case, was her older sister, or is her older sister. Ashley, both of her parents were members of the Blackfeet tribe. They grew up together as a family. Her parents started to run into some problems themselves, and it ultimately led to them temporarily being put in foster care very briefly with like a lovely, wonderful man who's a mayor of another town. And then very quickly they moved in with their grandparents, spent most of their lives growing up on their grandparents' ranch on the southern part of the reservation. An amazing place. You're sitting there in these beautiful plains fields staring out into the front of the Rocky Mountains, and it's just a gorgeous, wonderful place. Played on horses, like probably an excellent life for somebody who grew up on the reservation. But a couple things happened as she was growing up. She excelled academically, was a great basketball player at Browning Public High School. She was an athlete in other areas as well. But after she graduated, she went off to the local Blackfeet Community College. There's this great story that her boyfriend tells, that she was so studious and so excited about things. She had done some research on sort of migration of buffaloes, and it was so good that another community college in Montana, while she was a student, invited her to come over and present it. But she was like known as somebody who was a loving friend, who would stick up for people, who would really try and take care of people. When her sister Kimberly wanted Fluffy, their dog, when they were younger, she said that Kimberly could have Fluffy, but she needed to sign an adoption contract. So little Ashley, wrote her up the adoption contract. So really good heart, good student. What eventually happened, a set of events happened. Her grandfather that she grew up with got sick, and then he passed away. And that was very hard because he was like her dad. And then she broke up with her first love, who was her boyfriend. And soon after that, Ashley started hanging out with an older crowd on the reservation, people who were involved in drugs, and eventually began, using herself, partying. And I think all of that set her on this course to the moment that we get to in June of 2017. At that point, Kimberly, Ashley's sister, is in Morocco because she's, with the family of her soon-to-be husband. And she and Ashley communicate normally every day. They're constantly in contact, and they were planning for Kimberly's ultimate return. And then all of a sudden, once Kimberly arrived in early June, Ashley was nowhere to be found. And no one has seen her since that day. And that was the opening door to this, to what turns out to be sort of both a wild mystery and something very emblematic of the broader problems in solving some of these cases on reservations.
Can you explain to the audience the process of an investigation on a reservation, or maybe it's not the process, the jurisdictional issue on the reservation?
Yeah, and I can run through. It's a little bit different depending on the reservation, because each reservation has an option. They can select an approach where they have their own tribal law enforcement agency, or the Bureau of Indian Affairs can be their primary law enforcement agency. Many, I think, when they can, choose to have their own law enforcement agency. And generally, all misdemeanors and some more serious crimes are going to be handled by your tribal law enforcement agency, maybe by the BIA. But the state police also usually have jurisdiction on a reservation, and in some cases, the county police can get involved too when there are certain issues. And part of the reason why you have to have that dual-headed system is that on a reservation, as someone who's a non-native, I cannot be arrested by the tribal police. They only have the power to arrest people who are members of the tribe. So to arrest me, if I were on a reservation, let's say I was doing a breaking and entering, they would need to, in the old way it worked, but at the time where Ashley disappeared, the tribal police couldn't even temporarily detain me for the state police. Be like, peace, guys, good luck, come catch me. Now the courts have ruled that they can detain people and hold them who are non-natives for state police. But they would have to call the state police in, or they would have to call the FBI in for certain serious crimes. And, that's your murder, your arson, sexual assault. The FBI steps in as the primary law enforcement agency, BIA first, then the FBI, depending on what it is. So you essentially, in, most towns in America, you're going to have your local police department. You might have a county sheriff, might not, and then maybe your state police. So 2 to 3 agencies. So you're talking on most reservations, you're going to have 4 or 5 agencies that have some crossover jurisdiction. If you just think about it from a law enforcement perspective, like how many crimes do we hear about that are a sexual assault or a murder that are solved because you knew about some robbery that happened 3 months ago or some random thing?
Or a traffic stop. Or
a traffic stop. All this stuff is disconnected, right? So, and so when it comes to murder, though, murder is owned entirely by the FBI. And that might sound like a great thing to you, but, if you're familiar with law enforcement, one of the things that you know about the FBI is they don't really do murders. That's not their thing. The FBI primarily is an agency that's focused on terrorism, white-collar crime. They are focused on violations of, federal laws. And there are only a limited number of cases where murders are federal crimes. Murder in the commission of a carjacking or kidnapping or other things like that can kick it up to a federal crime. So you have agencies, you have the resources of the FBI, but you have agents who aren't used to investigating this kind of crime. And the local state police and the tribal police can only really support the FBI in that. And then it gets complicated by the second thing, which is, most of the people who are out in your more rural FBI offices, which are called resident agencies, most of the people who are out in those offices are very early in their careers. And they rotate out very quickly because they're trying to get to a big field office where they can do cool stuff. So you have a lot of turnover among the investigators who are on the case. You have a lot of cross-jurisdictional issues. I can even think on my recent trip, there was an incident where something was found that may have been related to the case. And, we called, or I didn't, but they called the local police, and I was listening to them on the speakerphone. And the local sheriff is like, well, not my case. I'm not coming out to get it, but it's on your jurisdiction. Yep, not doing it. They didn't say it as bluntly like that. They were like, the FBI has your sister's case. So we called the FBI, and, it wasn't easy because you're trying to get FBI agents on the weekend. They don't exactly have 911. We had to call headquarters. We had to call the Salt Lake field office and finally get an agent who is working the case and familiar with the case. And that agent is 400 miles away at that point with a piece of potential evidence sitting on the ground that the local sheriff won't come pick up. It's off of the reservation itself, so the tribal police can't come pick it up. So we're going through this rigmarole of madness just to, and imagine, this is just to pick up one piece of potential evidence. And so those kinds of complications are constantly coming up with cases. And so you can imagine what it's like when leads come in, or, there's a piece of evidence in the case that went missing for years. It got discovered again, but, the tribal police said the BIA had it. The BIA said maybe it's at the FBI lab. Finally, it was found in a closet inside of a BIA office. So those are the kinds of challenges that you run into in investigating these kinds of cases. And as knowledge, experience, coordination are key to solving serious crimes, particularly disappearances. And we don't see a lot of long-term disappearances either. So you really need to be well-oiled in those investigations and the jurisdictional issues. And this is certainly not unique to the Blackfeet Nation, but these jurisdictional issues create enormous complications in investigating cases.
Well, just the sheer lack of resources that they have. And you can correct me on this, but the report that I saw was there's about 17 officers that work the reservation, and the reservation is 1.5 million square miles, acres.
Yeah. Actually, I believe it's 1.5 million.
It's twice the size of Rhode Island.
Rhode Island, yes.
And you've got 17 officers, and the thing that I saw said they were funded for 50, but they couldn't get 50.
Couldn't get 50. Yeah. And so that also becomes a part of the challenge. And I think when I was up there, they were down 1. So they were at 16. And so, 1.5 million acres. And you think about that, right? If you just think about and imagine what it's like, and think you're running 24 hours a day. So people have to be on shifts. You have to have overnight. You're really talking like on the road. You're lucky when there's like 2 or 3 officers that are on the road for 1.5 million, multiple cities, not a ton of them. But, if there is a radio call to a far off part of the reservation, it could take a real long time to get a response. Also, no forensic capabilities. There's no lab within that space. Closest lab is at the University of Montana in Missoula, which is a good couple hours away. So a lot of the things that you would see in a modern police department in terms of resources, they just don't have over an enormous expanse of expanse of space. And so again, that creates an enormous challenge too in a case like Ashley's where, you're going to go search for someone. Well, where are you going to get those resources from? You need to really be able to bring in your law enforcement partners. You need to coordinate everything that is found, and missing persons cases, going back to your point before, are particularly difficult too, because most missing person cases, the vast majority of them, result in the person being found within hours or a couple of days of when they're reported missing. It is rare when there's a long-term missing person case. So in Ashley's case, just like a lot of other cases, when her family contacted them, and it took a couple tries, but when her family to get them to act, when her family contacted them, it was treated like most short-term disappearances. We're going to keep an eye out. We're going to be on the lookout. We're going to see what we could find. And it wasn't until she was gone for several weeks that they really started to put investigative resources through it. And it wasn't until like 8 months later that the FBI came in and took over the case. So that really hampers you and delays things. And I think that's a challenge in any missing persons case, right? Like we don't know when, we often don't know what signs to look out for that tell us that there's probably foul play or there's probably something wrong. And I think part of the challenge is a lot of that is really about victimology. Once you know a victim's patterns, their behaviors, and you see the deviations, that can be a big tip-off. that something's wrong, short of, you find blood all over the room. That's a safe bet something's up. But but that takes time, and it takes resources. And when you only have 17 officers, you got to kind of hope.
The whole 17 officers, to keep that in perspective, when I was with the Raleigh Police Department, we had a guy that went missing, and he had sold his car to an individual that was from Emporia, Virginia, which is out in the middle of nowhere. And
I'm familiar with it.
Yeah. And so when they go to search him, we find a bloody rag in his pocket.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And so, long story short, we figured out that he had killed the victim, and it was more of a recovery case. And so me and I think 30 other guys, with the help of detectives that were able to get on the victim's phone and triangulate how much time he had spent in certain areas. But this is a heavily wooded area / swamp and farmland that we're searching in. And we spent an entire day, checking out these spots. We knew where to look. And it still took us an entire day, and it ended up we found them because we found a bunch of vultures that had been circulating an area, and we found them on like a little country side road.
How long after when he went missing was the recovery?
Less than a week.
Okay. Yep. And I think that, one of the beauties of that is you still have something like vultures that are going to be up the sky. In Ashley's case, it was June 5th of 2017. That's when she was last seen by her mother in her bedroom at the family's ranch. And that night, she messaged a bunch of friends on Facebook asking them for a ride into town. And, what we basically know is that she packed a blue string backpack and ended up leaving with a friend. Later that night, and people didn't know this immediately, it took a while for this to come out, but later that night, a video surfaced. It was posted on Facebook, showing Ashley at a party on the reservation at a house. And she was sitting on a couch drinking with others. That same night and into the morning, she was texting Kimberly, who was traveling in Morocco, and she asked her for money. Kimberly asked her if she was okay, and Ashley replied, yes, always. That's what she said. And, that's the last known contact that they have. At this particular point, the police think that actually was Ashley, because in my mind, like in cases like this, I just generally don't assume anything to be true or accurate. And I've seen too many cases. I just did the case of missing woman in Kingsport, Tennessee, Layla Santana, and her boyfriend, who does not appear to be a suspect right now in her disappearance, but he was texting her mother nonstop, asking for money and asking for other things along those lines. But what essentially happens after that, so we're at the 5th of the 6th. Eventually, this story comes out from a local man in his 50s, member of the tribe, guy named Sam McDonald, who lived on a cabin on a lake with, his son Doug occasionally was there. But he lived on a cabin in a lake, and he tells this story of being out around that time, the 5th of the 6th, and, of running into Ashley, who didn't have a ride, and he suggested that she come with him. And then he tells a story of 6 days that the two of them spent at the cabin together. And the way Sam tells the story is that it was drug fueled, that it was a bit like a love affair, and that Ashley told him at the time that she thought that he had gotten her pregnant. There's some reasons to have some doubt about Sam's story, but what Sam's story is the first narrative that really sort of solidified post that 5th or 6th. So around the 13th, Sam says, and I don't know whether this does not necessarily fit with everything that we've heard, but Sam says that, Ashley had gotten out of control, that she was leaving the house in the middle of the night and walking over to other people's houses and then returning and all sorts of other stuff like that. And he had finally decided, like, hey, I need to get you some help. I need to get you home to your family. And he started suggesting to her that she go home. But then, according to Sam, he started taking Ashley home, driving from his house on the lake up this mountain, Divide Mountain, toward Browning. And she asked him to stop near the top of the mountain and drop her off at a small pull-off that kind of led to nowhere. And because a man named Paul, or the nickname that she supposedly used was V-Dog, but it was a man named Paul Valenzuela, was going to pick her up. And Sam said they had been doing a lot of meth, or he had been doing a lot of meth, and he got tired and passed out in the car. And then when he passed out in the car, Ashley was nowhere to be found. So that is kind of where the story stops there once Sam comes forward with his story. But there are a couple things about Sam's story that leave you some real doubts. And then there's some behaviors among other people afterwards that raise even more questions about the case.
So let's first with Sam.
Yep.
When I imagine a cabin on a lake, I'm thinking of a vacation rental, someplace I want to go. Maybe a small little pier where I'm catching trout on. Is that the image that you had, or you've actually been to this man's house?
Yep.
So can you describe of what it looked like?
Well, first of all, let me just say that, where it is in Babb, Montana is right on the edge of Glacier National Park. One of the most beautiful parts of Glacier National Park. And the lake itself is absolutely gorgeous. I mean, it is amazing. The mountains right off in the distance. It is beautiful. However, to get to Sam's cabin, you have to drive on an unmarked road. Like, there are no signs. There's nowhere to turn. On a gravel road out to the lake. And to call it a cabin, I guess it's a cabin, but it's really truly like a shack, made of like old wood, some of it broken and rotten, rickety, things falling apart. There's all sorts of crap in the front yard. And not to say that it's like junky, but it's a place where you have a hard time, even with meth, because I know meth is a great lure, imagining a young girl spending 6 days. Actually, you have a hard time imagining a second person fitting in there for 6 days under any circumstances. But that kind of is the scene in the scenario. It's just quite a contrast, like the gorgeous setting that you're looking at compared to the way that people on that lake are living.
When you're speaking with Sam, did you find him truthful in what he was telling you?
Yeah, well, it's hard to say, but I think that there are a lot of things in Sam's story that don't make a lot of sense to me. And I love whenever I'm working on reporting, covering a case in any way, I love getting my feet on the ground. I felt like the exact same thing about the Delphi murders out in Indiana. Getting out there to that trail, getting out to that bridge was so illuminating and, so clarifying on so many levels. And I felt the same way about tracing Ashley's footsteps to the top of the mountain, to Sam's cabin, driving around the area. One of the things that was really super clear to me, from Sam's cabin, you can head south on US 89, and it will take you up this really beautiful mountain, and with beautiful views of all sorts of other mountains. And, it'll eventually curve. 89 will curve, and you can take a left and go into downtown Browning, which is in more of the plains. So from Sam's house, you're essentially going from sort of, the lake is sort of more on the plain side. So you're going from the flat plain side, you're going up, around, and back down into the plains to get to Browning. Well, from Sam's house, before you go up the mountain, before you go up the divide, for the Continental Divide, you can actually just take a left and drive by a lake and go straight into Browning just as quickly, actually more quickly. So I sort of felt like this story that he told was his plan before Ashley said drop him off was to take her to her parents or take her to her family. Well, it makes no sense. You would have never gone that way at all to take her to her parents. And so that for me stuck out to me as a piece that just didn't feel right. And then when I did the drive several times, what I realized when I finally found the spot where he said he dropped her off, well, there are probably a half a dozen better spots that you could have dropped somebody off more safely. You could have dropped someone off where there were landmarks that someone coming to pick them up would have an easy time seeing. This spot was perhaps the worst spot that you could have picked and the hardest to potentially describe. So that stuck out into my mind too. And it's not that I expect a bunch of people who are on meth at any particular moment to be remarkably logical, but I've seen this movie enough to know the way that people do things that run along these lines. So I have a lot of question marks around Sam's behavior. And, some of the reporting I've done has raised some other eyebrows, including Sam's son, Doug, reportedly saying numerous times while drunk, and then also while he was in jail, that Dad hurt Ashley. And Sam denies all that, and when we were there, said he doesn't know why Doug's saying that, et cetera, et cetera. So that's Sam. And you would think with a suspect like Sam, keep on knocking on that door. And the FBI has searched this place numerous times. They've come back over and over again. They're not particularly open about what they do know and what they don't know and what they do believe about what he said and they don't believe about what he said. But, I always like to say the only worst thing than having a really good suspect in a case is having like 5 really good suspects in a case. Or, excuse me, the only worst thing than having no suspects in a case is having 5 really good suspects in a case.
So with Sam, are you of the belief that she never even made it to that cabin?
Yeah, it's really hard for me to say. I think it's possible that Ashley made it to the cabin. I do not think she was there for 6 days. I have a hard time believing that she was there for 6 days. One, because, and I think you probably get this from the perspective of law enforcement, but being a crime journalist, whether I was covering crime in Baltimore or New York, or, when somebody disappears and they regularly communicate with people, whether it's by cell phone, payphone, or however they regularly communicate, you can pretty much mark the moment of their disappearance to when they stop using their electronic devices.
Right, absolutely. And that's what I was wondering when she was asking for money from her sister, if she was using the same language and, slang that she would normally use with her sister? Or was that Sam, trying to get a couple more dollars out of it?
So it's really interesting. So I suspect that message was from Ashley, that asking about money. It's a very casual conversation. Hey, can you send me some money? No, can't really. How are you doing? Back and forth, very casual. There were some other messages that at a later point were sent that not from the phone per se, unclear whether it came from the phone or came to some other point, where there were phrases that Ashley wouldn't use that were sent in those messages. I believe law enforcement does not believe those messages came from her.
Yeah, and I know that it gets murky with the whole story because they have to look into it of Ashley getting dropped off and picked up by V-Dog.
Uh-huh.
When you look at him especially, he's an easy target because he's arrested later for possession of firearm by felon, and the feds were hitting him with that, so he's going to probably get 8 years or so. And he's got that past that I think is a very easy scapegoat.
Yep.
But the whole story just seems unbelievable to me.
Yeah, Sam's story is really, 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 really hard to believe. With Paul's background, Paul in Washington State had some felonies. He had the felon in possession of firearms issue. And actually, probably, depending on when Ashley disappeared, and this is where it becomes interesting, is that Paul either has a really good alibi or has a terrible alibi, whether you believe she disappeared on June 6th or you believe she disappeared on June 13th. Because in between that period, Paul had to travel to Washington State for a court hearing. And we knew he was in that court hearing. At the hearing, he told the judge he was going to come back to Browning to take care of some of his affairs before coming back to Washington State. So if Ashley disappeared around the 6th or the 7th or the 8th, Paul has a much better alibi than if she actually disappeared when Sam said she disappeared, because Paul may very well have been headed back. So I think Paul's an easy target in town. There are a handful of names in town that are connected to an assortment of different things that pretty consistently come up. I've gone through court records in some of Paul's cases, including, his most recent case, which actually is linked to Ashley's investigation in a tangential way. But it's pretty clear that Paul's son was involved in drugs. His son was involved, although not the trigger puller, in a shooting that happened at his school. That was hanging over his son's head. And it looks like the FBI and law enforcement used that as leverage over Paul to try and get him to cooperate and to talk. And, where we get the story of Paul comes from Sam, visiting V-Dog. But where we also get the story of Paul being involved in it is from Ashley's cousin, Tashina Eastwood Crane, who was Paul's wife at the time. Kimberly, when she got back and she couldn't find Ashley, she thought, who do I know who's involved in that drug scene, or what family member do I know? And she thought Tashina, who's her cousin. She calls up Tashina and says, hey, have you seen Ashley? And Tashina blows up and says, Kimberly says, out of the gate, you should talk to Paul. Paul saw her and started sort of cursing about Paul and bitching about Paul and telling her that she needed to talk to Paul. So she calls Paul, and who she had never she had never communicated with. But she calls Paul, and Paul says, before she even gets out of the gate, she just basically asks about, Tashina said, I should call you about Ashley, that you picked her up at some point at a gas station earlier, so you might know where she is. And Paul immediately says, Tashina is lying. She's trying to set me up. Don't believe me. So we got two vectors pointing at Sam, Tashina, and also Sam. But in all of that, when you look at like his alibi, his cooperation that you can see a little bit of in his federal indictment, what he eventually ended up going to jail for was threatening a federal agent. Well, that threatening was in the process of his cooperation on Ashley's case. And in the text messages, when you dig into the text messages that were used as part of this threatening, there are a couple small clues that he was going to be a part of attempting to get someone to confess to the case. And then eventually he got charged on that one because of the threat that he had made to the officers. And maybe they thought they could use that as even deeper leverage, and he ended up going to jail. But I think this may be one of those odd situations where the person who has the worst rap sheet may not necessarily be like your number one suspect. A lot of people default to Paul because of that background, but there are a lot of things that sort of suggest, while Paul was probably a bad guy, he may not have been responsible, and he may not have physically been in the area during the time.
And that was kind of my thought. I know that you've spoke with her family, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
What does her family feel about this, and are they leaning towards one person or the other?
Oh, I think they're open. They're open to what I would call the three main suspects, and we haven't even really touched on the third person, but they're open to. I think they're open to all of the suspects. I think that. I think that the toughest thing for them is that, this universe of people who say they either interacted with her or point the finger at each other for interactions in the last few days are all clearly lying about some element or withholding, right? Paul isn't talking that much. You'll see in the story that Tashina is also very clearly lying about some things. And then also Sam appears to be lying about some things. So I think what the families call is just, somebody tell us the truth. We just want to bring her home. And Kimberly said to me in an episode I did with her, like, she doesn't even care. She doesn't even care if there's justice. She just wants to bring her sister back to the ranch where she belongs. So...
As far as the police are concerned, do you think that the historical problems between the federal government or conflict between the federal government, the U.S. federal government, and the people on the reservation, is that why people are not talking? Or I know that meth was involved in this case, and I'm not trying to belittle anyone because of it, but if people are involved in nefarious activities, they're going to probably be less willing to cooperate.
Unless they can get something out of it. Right. Yeah, unless they can get something out of it. I mean, I think we're dealing with a case that's probably not a grand conspiracy, if that makes sense, where there's probably not a lot of people involved, but there are probably a lot of people who've got some really good clues. And I think that there's probably some reluctance to share those clues for a number of different reasons. One is about local law enforcement in general, right? Under-resourced staff. One of the real big challenges when you have a tribal police department, relatively small population, many of us are related to each other. Do we hire from the outside, right? Do we hire from other tribes? Do we hire from local police departments to be tribal officers, right? So that's a question. Blackfeet Nation, most of the tribal police officers are from the Blackfeet Nation, have gone to the Montana State Academy and all of those other things. So you have close interconnections, and that creates some resistance in wanting to come forward. You know, it's been documented, for example, that Tashina, Paul's wife, at one point dated a man named Kenny Boudreau, who's one of the Blackfeet police officers assigned to the case. You know, and the way that I got the real hard documentation of that, there was a confrontation between Tashina and Kenny's wife at the hospital, pregnant wife at the hospital, that kind of brought light to that whole thing. So you can see how, you know, there would be some reluctance to share with the investigators locally. Then you have the problems with that. I think the FBI and the BIA, you have the historical problems that have existed in general. You have the lack of trust because of, you know, drug cultures, also native tribes. You know, when you as a culture, and I think this speaks to many native peoples, have been constantly sold on these ideas like, oh, let's relocate you to big cities, but it's really about getting you off the reservation so we can take back the land and we can get the oil. When you have been sold on, you know, having your reservation preserved, but then it's been checkerboarded and other people have been allowed to jump in the middle of it and you've been spread apart. When, you know, things like the Indian Removal Act or the different efforts to sort of break down their systems by the federal government, they're almost always brought in pretty packages where the federal government says this can make your life better and the actual result is something very harmful. So I think there's some general mistrust of the federal government, period, that's at play. And also the bulk of the FBI's time on the reservation, because if you think about where we're talking northwest Montana between Missoula and the Canadian border, sort of like if you keep on going straight up, you head toward Calgary. Well, reservations are a great place to traffic drugs, right? I know that they're gonna big space, not a lot of law enforcement. I swear I saw one cop while I was on the Blackfeet Reservation my entire time there, and I don't think I saw another cop from Browning all the way down to Missoula, whether it was Blackfeet or whether it was state. So you've got that problem. So a lot of the FBI's focus on the Blackfeet Reservation at the time was breaking up the hold of drug organizations in the area. And so you can see how that FBI focus on breaking up and targeting the drug organizations, you may have ended up targeting some of the people, or some of the people who may have helpful information right now may have been in the crosshairs. So that really complicates things, if that makes sense.
What do you think the solution is to get a case like this solved?
Oh, man, if I knew, honestly, Brian, I would go solve it. I wouldn't be talking about it. You know, like I honestly think that in a case like this, there is enough out there in the universe of details and stories people have told to know that there is more information. There is someone out there who has enough information. You know, hopefully there's somebody whose conscience will get tugged, or something along those lines, because it's really going to take somebody saying something. You have to almost start in this story. If you believe that Sam's story is not true, I think a first step in solving it is, and assuming Sam, let's say, had nothing to do with it, is Sam telling a more truthful story. that would be unbelievably helpful, because then you can sort of like narrow in on things. If Sam's story is true and Paul was going to pick her up and he did pick her up, then it really starts there. Like I said, Tashina is not exactly helping herself. She's made TikTok videos where she, in one of them relatively recently, she was talking about, essentially it's your fault if you can't call 911 after being stabbed while pregnant with somebody else's baby, right? Like, she has made several really weird videos that seem to be suggesting or that she wants people to believe that she was somehow involved in some aspect of this. So between those three, I believe you have the answer, and I think it's the people who are around them. I think you may get an answer out of Paul if you can offer him something. He's a stone cold criminal. Like, he knows. Right. Don't trade anything for something else. But I think someone around them in the universe of them, it probably has information that's going to help at least point people in the right direction on this case.
Yeah, and then my thought has always been that people are greedy.
Yep.
That's the number one. If you get the reward high enough, someone will come forward. And with men, usually it is that you've got to get a charge on them, and then get them a deal.
Yep.
Or you get someone close to Sam who's buying meth from him, and
you can flip on him for who can flip on other reasons. And I also think another key to solving this case, and I was really heartened by this because, there's a newer FBI agent who's been put on the case who wants to be in Montana, is interested in staying there for a while. So hopefully we'll be able to put some energy into the case, really responsive, I think. Just to give you an example, that piece of evidence moment was a little weird and a little difficult, but once the FBI was on the phone, they were on the phone. They got the U.S. attorney on a Saturday, an assistant United States attorney too. Like, they were on it hard. So I think dedicated resources from the FBI, fresh eyes, I think would be really helpful. I think it would be super helpful for somebody to go over all these stories and all these files with absolute fresh eyes. I just think someone will see something that the original investigators, even if they're looking at it right now, would have a hard time seeing. The part I think that baffles me, like the human part of this that baffles me, Brian, Cameron. I can't stop myself. Probably not the first time that's happened, right? I think the part that baffles me about this case is how hard would it be for someone to send an anonymous note, have an anonymous phone call, and at least let the family recover her body. Now, I understand why that doesn't happen, because if you've murdered someone, you think of things from the perspective of risk. If a body's found, there's more risk to me. But, I think on a more human side, I have a hard time imagining not wanting to be tempted to let that family have Ashley back. The reservation's so vast. Glacier National Park is so vast. The Flathead Reservation on the other side of the mountains is so vast. I don't think after all these years, it's going to be really easy to come across a well-concealed body. Like I mentioned, those two huge lakes, all the mountains. When you drive through that area, if you've ever been on the Going to the Sun Road in Glacier National Park, there's another one of a similar style that runs right into this mountain, Divide Mountain. And, we're talking 50, 60, 70-foot drop-offs. Just right off the side of the road. I mentioned the lakes, I mentioned Glacier. There are so many places to put a body or for a body to be dragged by wild animals. I really think it's gonna, and because of the space that we're in, like we're right on the Continental Divide. If you had gone into the plains in one direction or the other side of the park in the other direction, you are going to run into things like hunters and fishers and other things like this. We're not talking about an area that's going to be hunted unless all of a sudden mountain climbers start hunting, So it's not going to be the blueberry picker or the hunter who comes across this stuff, because just a lot of the space that would be accessible throwing someone or something is just not. It's not accessible to humans.
Yeah, and she's not a big person either. She's
Very
about 5'2", and here's a picture of her, and about 100 pounds. So,
wet.
From the logistical aspect, if you are reporting that you dropped her off 6 days, and you have essentially a 6-day gap where you can get rid of that body, make sure that the evidence, whatever clothing that you're wearing, is completely gone. That's a lot of time before you report it and start worrying about people poking around.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it really begs the question for me of if that story is not true, because I tend to be of the mind that when the electronics go off, you can almost bet that the person is gone, particularly a woman of her age during that time with her sister coming back the next day. It begs the natural question, the one that Julia Callie over the consult would definitely ask, which is, why would someone like Sam take the risk to tell a story like that? Like, why?
That's my whole thing too. Right. It's like, why go through this elaborate story? Why 6 days? Sure, you're on meth. I get that. But do we really believe that she was there for 6 days and the two of you, and he's 50 and she looks, was she 20 years old, I believe?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, 20.
Mm-hmm.
So a 50-year-old and this guy does not look like a good 50 either.
No,
he looks like he's been smoking meth and lives in a shack.
Yeah.
And she's young. She's got a future ahead of her, even though she does have these difficulties in her life. I've got a really hard time believing that they spent 6 days together. I could see that maybe she's intoxicated or she's high and they go back to his cabin for a night. She wakes up and wants to leave.
In 6 days without plugging in her phone once, or without, she's from the community. People are not that far away from where she is. So, I'm really suspicious of that part of it. There are reasons to make me believe, and it goes back to that thing, I was saying, why take the risk? Well, one reason you might take the risk, hypothetically, of telling a tall tale like that is that she was at your house at some point.
Right.
And you think somebody may have seen her there, or somebody saw her there, or your son saw her there. So you need some elaborate explanation of what's happening. And there are a lot of unknowns in the story. Tashina and Paul obviously know each other, but we don't know the extent of whether they had a relationship with Sam. There's some people in the community who say yes. Unclear. I mean, what we do know is that Paul was heavily involved in drug running, and that Sam was heavily involved in using drugs at the very minimum. Probably.
Do you think he was cooking out there? I mean,
hard for me to say. It's hard for me to say. I mean, it's totally possible. There's like a little shack off to the side that I could totally see it as a possibility. If I had to guess, though, that his house was probably more likely to be a place where people would come over to use.
Okay.
Like that it would be, the crash house to use. It's always really hard to say. But I had a chance to talk to a lot of people who were there. People are not unfamiliar with his cabin who are involved in that universe. And so that's another part of the story that's kind of odd, given his drug use, given the fact that, we know people on meth blow through their meth, that in this story at this house where I knew lots of people would normally visit, well, where are the people who said they saw Ashley?
And that's kind of where I get back to is that I think it's either two scenarios. Either A, she never left that cabin, or B, I think there's a possibility, considering the human trafficking issue that's around that area, that he wanted some more meth. He didn't have the money to do it. He's got a 20-year-old female. He calls up Paul and says, "Hey, I've got Ashley over here."
I mean, it's possible. Now, Paul did have a pre-existing relationship with the family, and had clearly met Ashley before, and that's an interesting piece of it. There's nothing, though, to suggest that he had any animosity toward Ashley, but there has been an accusation by Tashina that she thought Paul was in a relationship with Ashley. Unconfirmed, like there are some family members who tend to think maybe something had started in the weeks before between the two of them. But it's really interesting, right? In most cases, you would say, like, well, look at the domestic partner, look at the ex-boyfriend, look at whoever it could have possibly been. But I like your theory of somebody wanted some drugs and, like an underlying motivation to this entire story. When
I just don't buy that.
When I covered crime in Baltimore,
right,
we talk about the holy trinity of murder. And the holy trinity of murder is relationships, drugs, and money.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think you got relationships here. You definitely have drugs here. And I think those being deeply intertwined with this story, I think is a likely version of events. And if these people are all interconnected, and to just drill down for you how deep the connections between these people are, I was listening to the Unfound podcast by Ed Denzel, and he was doing the case of Leo Wagner, who's a missing kid from the reservation, disappeared a couple years after Ashley, was actually a family friend of the Lorings, was a searcher for Ashley in the weeks after. Several times he went searching for her. Disappeared on St. Mary's Lake himself. Leo Wagner was at a party a couple days before at the same house that Ashley was supposedly at the party a couple days before. I'm not saying it's connected to the crime, but it's more to give you an idea of like how intertwined all of these people and these interconnections are, and why it's so hard to pull a thread. And I'll give you another fact that's really interesting. There's a woman named Haley Amiso who grew up with Ashley. She was one of the few people around their class that went off to college, went off to the University of Montana, was a sophomore when Ashley disappeared. Remember seeing it on TV and being like, oh my God, Ashley. And Ashley's disappearance is actually, led Haley to go into forensic science, started a nonprofit lab. She's totally focused on bringing those high-end services, forensic crime scene services, to reservations. I know from talking to people, she's respected by the state police, respected by the FBI, gives trainings to other people. So she's a PhD student right now. So she's 27. And Ashley disappeared when Ashley was 20. So Ashley disappeared, let's see, we're in 2025. So we're talking in the 8 years since Ashley disappeared. Out of her class at Browning High School, her classmates at the time, so a couple hundred people, 10 are dead or missing.
Oh, wow.
She's 27. 10 are dead or missing. So, Ashley's case is one that resonates. It's one that needs to be solved. But it is one piece into a much broader mosaic of the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous people. I just remember Haley telling me that and me nearly falling out of my seat to think that, like, by the time I was her age, I think we had, I was in a school 10 times the size of hers. And I remember one classmate who had died in a motorcycle accident, much less 10 in 7 to 8 years being missing or murdered. And that has a toll on people and a boomerang effect. And you get the idea, right? Like, if you're dealing with the epidemic from that perspective, for them, for you and me, if our classmate was Ashley and she disappeared, probably shock the conscious, right? Like, there would be guilt, there would be worry, there would be everybody reporting everything they could to try and solve it. But in a community where, Ashley is one of 10 during that period, and you don't necessarily have good relationships with law enforcement, and there aren't a lot of resources. And if you do end up in trouble or people think you're talking, there's nobody to protect you. So you already believe the system, is going to fail you in general, probably won't solve the crime. Decreases the likelihood you're going to stick your neck out there. And you've also probably become sort of somewhat immune to some of these things. If I think about the people who are with Ashley the last 2 weeks of her life, there are 9 who have either committed suicide, been murdered. One guy had his head chopped off. It was horrific murder. Murdered, suicides, drug overdoses. It's 9 in the 2 weeks connected to her. So when you're seeing that kind of horror around you, like, it's hard to find, I think, hope in the idea that we're going to solve Ashley's case and it's going to be all okay, because it's not going to be all okay.
Right. I mean, even if her case gets solved, you still have the constant flood of cases coming in. And we're even talking about the cases that are reported.
Yep.
A lot of these are not reported, or they're reported as instead of classifying it properly as a missing person, it's, oh, well, you know what, that person they're 20 years old, they're on drugs, we're just going to ignore it, right? Like,
yep.
I know that, with every department, you'll see that, where guys will take shortcuts. And unfortunately, those are the departments that, when a predator comes, and, you look at places like Michigan, there's several cases of, or actually, this is a national thing of most serial killers go after prostitutes. Why? Because when they get reported missing, the police go, "Oh, she was a prostitute. No, she overdosed somewhere, or she's in inner city."
Yeah, like you
No
pick,
problem.
it's just like war. You pick the most permissive environment to move forward. And I remember, I'll never forget sitting in New York late at night at a crime scene where we could get close to the line, and we're chatting with the detectives, and one of the detectives turns to me and says, NHI. And I was like, what does NHI mean? He was like, no humans involved. Like, this dead woman, the perp, clearly not. He's like, nobody's going to care at City Hall. Nobody's going to care at the police department. They're going to treat this like no humans are involved. And unfortunately, I think, predators kind of know those environments. And, you were talking about the jurisdictional issues earlier. And then what I mentioned about the legal challenge of not being able to arrest non-natives. It is if you are a predator, if you are looking to rob someone's house, if you are, looking to prey on people in any way, it is an excellent environment. You don't even have to go to the edge of 3 counties to have enormous jurisdictional issues on any crime you commit. You have understaffed law enforcement. You have a vulnerable population that doesn't have a lot of money, doesn't have like a way to advocate as much as other communities. It's an environment that's like, for the same reason the drug runners use it to run their drugs through it. It's an excellent environment for predators. And so in cases like Ashley's or Leo Wagner's that I mentioned before, it really falls to the families. Since 2018, Kimberly has led over 120 searches or events related to Ashley. She continues to press law enforcement. She continues to press the suspects directly to speak about her sister's life, her legacy. And, I just want to take a second to honor what she's done for the search for her sister, because, the picture, I don't want to just tell the story of her death, but because her life was really beautiful. Like, she really was, they joke about how victims always light up the room, right? Or, we tend to believe in that. But what I'll tell you is, when you're a reporter, you'll go report on the victim who lit up the room, and you'll find lots of bad things about them. And it's not the case in Ashley's case. She's flawed, like all of us are, but a truly good, genuine, creative person who was going to go far in life and had the potential to have such a positive impact. They lost something in that community, but we all lose something when something like that happens. When I look at Haley and I look at all of her success and her impact and the positive that she's going to bring on, that could have been another Ashley, right? Ashley could have been that person too. I seriously doubt she's alive. I just feel like we lost a real treasure. There's some lucky angel up there somewhere, but I feel like we lost a real treasure. And I think it's worth it to try and get to the truth, to find answers, to have justice. I think that's a very important piece of it. But I also believe, it wouldn't be over if we had a confession tomorrow, because I think we need to bring her home where she belongs.
Right. Absolutely. And you're absolutely right. I mean, I was looking at pictures of her, and you can tell she looks like a young college girl.
Mm-hmm.
This isn't a hardened criminal, or she had, unfortunately, with the reservation and with drug use and with alcohol use, it's very common, and it sounds like it's very accessible.
Yeah.
I don't say it's part of their culture, because it's, not, but it's common to the point where I think that they're leveling degrees of drug use, and, there are people that live in shacks, and then there are people like her who may have just lost her way a little bit and
Yep.
trying to get on the right track. But she did have a bright future. She was a good student. She had goals. She had family that cares about her. And it is an absolute tragedy that we haven't been able to bring her home yet. And hopefully someone will come forward and do that.
Yeah. And I think you make a really good point. Like you mentioned the idea that it's not a part of their culture, but it's become kind of embedded. There's an element, if you talk to tribal leaders, the Blackfeet Nation or any other tribe I've talked to, they know that there are problems that they need to solve within their communities. What they'd really love from us first would be to stop making it so hard. Take your feet off our neck, but they recognize that there's problems with them. And if you think this environment isn't relatable, then I would encourage you to go visit the Upper Peninsula of Michigan or go visit, rural parts of Nebraska where you can see things like this. This is something that exists outside of Native communities having these kinds of challenges. I just think because of our laws, our criminal justice system, it gets exasperated there. And then when you take this history of erasure and you put it on top of it, and this disconnection because they don't feel like, quote, the rest of us or look like the rest of us, it's a problem that's unlikely to be solved. I always joke with my friends who are reporters, mostly white reporters. I'm like, guys, because I hail from Baltimore and I also hail from New York in my reporting career. And I'm like, did you guys notice that all of a sudden America started to have an opioid epidemic once white people started dying? But I was like, because if you were in Baltimore, there's been an opioid epidemic since the 1970s.
Yeah.
But I think what can we do? Now, here's where the running joke goes, right? One of the blessings of that, not to say that Baltimore's heroin problem has been solved, one of the blessings that is that opioid addiction became very relatable once more people started to get affected by it and more resources went into it. So how can we look at the people at the reservation more like ourselves and treat them the same way and help get them the same resources that we get to other communities? It's exactly what you said. Look in the eyes of Ashley and look in the eyes of Haley and look in the eyes of Kimberly and tell me you don't see the same thing that's in you and the same thing that's in everyone you love. They're no different than us. They're just humans trying to survive in this world. And we know there's a problem there. And I think it makes sense for all of us to be committed to help solve this problem in some way. And it's going to be very different for all of us and how we can do it. But, I'm really committed to that idea and that notion. I cannot control our past as a country, but I can do my part in this piece of the timeline that I've been in to do what I can to make sure their stories are not erased, that Ashley's not erased, and that we fight for justice because it's the right thing for all humans.
I think that's actually a very good point to end on.
Well, I appreciate you. I'm glad that we can bring some awareness to this case, and I've been looking forward to coming on, and I'm looking forward to watching what you're doing. I have, I'll just add the piece that I do appreciate the perspective, and I appreciate what you're bringing to the table, and I'm happy to, help you or come on any day you want.
Yeah, and I appreciate it too. And I love to get a different perspective because from the law enforcement perspective with this, my thought is immediately, okay, you want to clean up that area? We're going to go in there and just hammer people.
Right.
We're going to be by. And just the greed will take over. and someone will confess, you know.
I
You make
wish
them
it
out
were
big enough. Yeah. We're getting up charges on them, they'll start talking. But I know that you can't really do that with the reservation. You know, it's a different
kind
feel
of.
like if we're trying to investigate in France as
Right.
Americans.
Yes. Yeah.
And everyone has to respect each other, and we have to find a way to get along and to work at these cases, you know, by pulling our resources together.
Yep. And, you know, you're hitting on like a really great point there that I think that one of the things that I've learned from my work with tribes over the last few years that, you know, I may have something to offer to bring to the table, but I want to do it in a culturally competent way. And I want to be able to help and I want to be able to contribute. And, you know, I think the important thing is to do exactly what you're doing, which is instead of just leaning into our expertise, really spending the time to figure out what might work and what might be helpful and what's been tried is like huge in any community you land in.
Well, how can people support you?
Well, I take checks. I take cash. No, I have an OnlyFans. No. Well, I mean, I think the things that you can really do is advocate for these kinds of cases, you know, unsolved cases, cold cases, cases like Ashley's. You can go to my podcast, which is called the Silver Linings Handbook, because in part, I am just an unrelenting optimist. And you can listen to a lot of these cases, find ways to advocate, find ways to get involved. You know, these families have really been left to, you know, to fight and advocate on their own. You'd be surprised at, you know, when you're on the Navajo reservation and you're going over millions and millions of acres, how far a $10, $5 gift card for gas might help a family get somewhere to a meeting. So no matter whether you're going to get involved like me and you want to go start digging and talking to people, or whether you want to get involved in some other way, there are opportunities. And if you want to sort of like give me a present, feel free to reach out and ask me how you can get involved in helping in some of these cases, and I'll find a way.
Well, I appreciate it. And I've really, again, I can't thank you enough for coming on the show and giving your expertise in this and your perspective. Yeah, but if anyone would like to support me, you can like and subscribe to Santana True Crime. You can follow us on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube. You can also purchase my book, which is A Murder on Campus, a professor of the cop, and North Carolina's most notorious cold case. There you go, which I wrote with my brother, Brian. Jason, thank you again. Have a good night.